October 1984 was unseasonably warm in northern Alabama. The kudzu still clung green to the telephone poles, and the air carried that thick, honeyed humidity that makes your shirt stick to your back even after the sun goes down. Clara Whitmore worked Tuesday through Saturday at the Pine Bluff Public Library, a modest brick building on the edge of town where the card catalog still ruled and the smell of old paper mingled with floor wax. She was quiet in the way librarians are supposed to be, not shy exactly, but measured, thoughtful, the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke, who catalogued the world around her with the same care she gave to the Dewey Decimal System. On the evening of October 16th, Clara closed the library at 6:30, just as she always did. The assistant librarian, Donna Pruitt, remembered waving goodbye from the parking lot, watching Clara's powder-blue Datsun pull onto Highway 157, heading south toward her rented cottage near Crooked Creek. Donna would later tell investigators that nothing seemed wrong. Clara had smiled, maybe a little tired, but normal. She'd checked out a book for herself, a collection of Flannery O'Connor stories, and tucked it into her canvas bag. That was the last time anyone saw Clara Whitmore alive. By 7:15 the next morning, a logger named Raymond Tutwiler spotted the Datsun on the shoulder of Highway 157, about 9 miles south of town. The car was still running, driver's door wide open like someone had stepped out to check a tire and simply never returned. The headlights had drained the battery overnight, but the engine kept that low, dying rumble. Raymond approached cautiously. You didn't just walk up on abandoned cars in those days without a second thought, and peered inside. The keys dangled from the ignition. A leather purse sat undisturbed on the passenger seat, wallet and identification still inside. The Flannery O'Connor book lay open on the dashboard, pages rippling in the morning breeze, but no Clara. Raymond backed away slowly, something cold creeping up his spine, and drove to the nearest gas station to call the sheriff. Within an hour, Cullman County deputies had cordoned off the scene, and by afternoon a search party of 30 volunteers combed the woods on either side of the highway. The forest there is dense, loblolly pine and sweet gum tangled with underbrush, the ground soft with decades of fallen needles. You could lose yourself in those woods without trying, locals said. You could walk 10 feet off the road and disappear into shadow. It was a volunteer firefighter, Lucas Brennan, who found the shoe. 20 feet into the tree line, half buried in red clay mud near a shallow creek bed, lay a single white canvas tennis shoe, Clara's, confirmed later by her sister. The laces were still tied. There were no signs of struggle nearby, no torn fabric, no blood. Just the shoe sitting there like a breadcrumb in a fairy tale that had gone horribly wrong. And that's when things started to feel off. The search dogs brought in from Huntsville picked up Clara's scent from the car, followed it into the woods for maybe 30 yards, then stopped abruptly. The handlers said the dogs seemed confused, circling the same spot near a rotting oak stump, whining low in their throats. One of the German shepherds, a seasoned tracker named Rex, sat down and refused to go further. His handler, a man named Jimmy Calhoun, who'd worked search and rescue for 15 years, later admitted to a local reporter that he'd never seen Rex act like that. It was like he hit a wall, Jimmy said, like the trail just ended. They expanded the search grid. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the underbrush, calling Clara's name until their voices went hoarse. Helicopters from the state police flew low over the canopy. Divers checked Crooked Creek and the murky retention ponds that dotted the area. For 6 days the search consumed the county, and then, slowly, as leads dried up and hope faded, the operation scaled back. By the end of October, Clara Whitmore was officially listed as a missing person, presumed dead, cause unknown. But the details, the strange nagging details, those lingered. Deputy Thomas Riggins, one of the first responders to the scene, wrote in his incident report that the ground around Clara's car showed unusual impressions in the soft shoulder dirt. He described them as inconsistent with normal foot traffic, noting that some of the depressions seemed too large, spaced too far apart. He took photographs, grainy Polaroids that would later be filed away in a cardboard evidence box and forgotten. When asked about it years later, Riggins, now retired and living in a nursing home in Decatur, would only say that he'd seen a lot of crime scenes in his career, but never one that made him feel like he was being watched from the trees. Then there were the scratches. On the driver's side door of Clara's Datsun, just above the handle, investigators noted 3 parallel grooves in the paint. Deep, deliberate marks that scored down to the metal. The county forensic team, such as it was in 1984, couldn't determine what made them. They were too uniform to be accidental, too deep to be from tree branches. One deputy suggested an animal, maybe a bear, though black bears were uncommon in that part of Alabama and rarely aggressive. Another thought it might be vandalism, someone keying the car before or after Clara disappeared. But the marks were high, almost 5 feet off the ground, and angled downward like something tall had dragged claws across the surface. No one could explain it. So it went into the file with everything else that didn't fit. The weeks turned to months. Clara's family, her younger sister Beth and her elderly parents, held a memorial service at Cullman First Baptist in December, though there was no body to bury. The community mourned, then moved on the way communities do, folding the tragedy into the background hum of life. Clara's cottage was cleaned out, her belongings boxed up. The library put a small plaque on the circulation desk in her memory, and the case, like so many others, went cold. But in a county like Cullman, stories don't really die. They transform. Within a year, locals started talking about the stretch of Highway 157 where Clara vanished. Teenagers driving home late claimed they saw a figure standing near the tree line, tall and motionless, just beyond the reach of their headlights. A trucker passing through in 1987 reported that his CB radio filled with static near mile marker 43, and when the interference cleared, he swore he heard a woman's voice whispering help before cutting out entirely. Hunters avoiding the area near Crooked Creek said the woods felt wrong there, too quiet, like the birds knew to stay away. Most people chalked it up to legend, the way ghost stories grow around tragedy, but some, the ones who'd been there during the search, weren't so sure. Raymond Tutwiler, the logger who found Clara's car, stopped taking jobs in that section of forest. When pressed by friends over beers at the VFW, he'd only say he didn't like the smell. What smell, they'd ask. Raymond would stare into his drink and mutter, like wet metal and spoiled meat. You smell it, you know something ain't right. Lucas Brennan, who found the shoe, moved to Tennessee 2 years later. He never spoke publicly about Clara's case again. And Deputy Riggins, he requested a transfer to traffic detail and never worked another missing persons case. For 40 years, Clara Whitmore existed in that liminal space between memory and myth. Her case file gathered dust in the Cullman County Sheriff's Office basement, periodically reviewed by new detectives hoping to crack the unsolvable, but nothing ever came of it. DNA technology advanced, databases expanded, cold cases across the country were reopened, re-examined, solved. But Clara's case had no body, no evidence of foul play beyond the obvious fact of her absence. There was nothing to test, nothing to match, until there was. In March of 2024, a construction crew breaking ground for a new Dollar General off County Road 1181, about 16 miles northwest of where Clara's car was found, unearthed something in the red clay. At first they thought it was an animal carcass, maybe a deer that had crawled into a hollow to die. But when the foreman, a man named Dale Kunze, climbed down into the shallow excavation to take a closer look, he realized what he was seeing. Bones. Human bones. Partially buried, partially exposed by decades of erosion and root growth, and tangled among the remains, flecks of pale yellow fabric. Dale called 911, and within hours, the site was swarming with investigators. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation took over, carefully excavating the remains and transporting them to the State Forensic Lab in Montgomery. Dental records were inconclusive. The skull showed significant trauma and degradation, but tissue samples, miraculously preserved in the clay's anaerobic conditions, yielded viable DNA. On April 9, 2024, the match came back. Clara Jean Whitmore had been found. The news hit Cullman like a thunderclap. After 40 years, there was an answer, or at least the beginning of one. But with the confirmation came new questions, darker and stranger than before. The location of the remains didn't make sense. 16 miles from her car, in the opposite direction from her home. How did she get there? The terrain between Highway 157 and County Road 1181 was brutal. Dense forest, steep ravines, no roads. If Clara had been taken, why move her body so far into the wilderness? If she'd tried to flee, why run away from help, deeper into the woods? And then there was the skeleton itself. Dr. Lena Hartwell, the forensic anthropologist who examined Clara's remains, noted several anomalies in her official report. The bones showed signs of perimortem trauma, injuries sustained at or near the time of death, but the patterns were unusual. Fractures to the ribs and pelvis suggested significant force, consistent with a fall from height or impact with a vehicle, but there were no corresponding signs of vehicular involvement. More troubling were the marks on the long bones of the arms and legs, deep grooves and scoring that Dr. Hartwell initially struggled to classify. In her preliminary notes, she wrote, striations consistent with predation or scavenging, possibly canine or large mammal. However, depth and spacing are atypical. Further analysis required. She never filed a final report that satisfied her own standards. When interviewed by a journalist from the Birmingham News, Dr. Hartwell chose her words carefully. The remains show evidence of trauma, she said, but the exact mechanism of injury remains unclear. It's not a pattern I've encountered in my 30 years of forensic work. Was that just the evidence speaking, or something we can't explain? Back in Cullman, Beth Whitmore, now 67, her auburn hair gone silver, sat in the same kitchen where she'd waited for news in 1984 and wept. Not from grief, not anymore. She'd mourned her sister decades ago. These were tears of vindication, of relief that Clara had finally been brought home. But beneath the relief, Beth felt something else, a gnawing unease that wouldn't go away. I always thought someone took her, Beth told reporters gathered on her front porch. I thought it was a man, someone passing through. I thought she'd be found near the road, buried shallow, the way these things usually go. But 16 miles into the woods? How does that happen? The police had no good answer. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the case and offered possibilities. Perhaps Clara had been held somewhere, escaped, and died of exposure trying to find her way out. Perhaps her abductor panicked and moved the body to a secondary location. Perhaps, every theory had holes, every explanation left something unaccounted for. And then there were the things the police didn't release to the public. A source within the Cullman County Sheriff's Office, speaking on condition of anonymity, revealed that the excavation site showed signs of disturbance beyond the construction crew's machinery. The clay around Clara's remains was compacted in strange ways, and there were impressions in the surrounding soil that matched no known tool or animal track. Large, elongated depressions with what appeared to be claw-like points at one end. The same source mentioned that soil samples taken from the site contained trace amounts of an unidentified organic compound, something with a high sulfur content that smelled, in the words of one lab technician, like rotten eggs mixed with wet dog. Officially, these findings were inconclusive. Unofficially, they were filed under unexplained. The DNA breakthrough that solved Clara's case didn't come from her remains alone. Investigators, using modern familial DNA techniques, cross-referenced genetic material found on the yellow cardigan fragments with national databases. They were searching for a suspect, for a match that might lead them to Clara's killer. What they found instead was more DNA, unidentified, non-human, but not matching any known species in the forensic animal database. Contamination, the lab report concluded. Degradation due to time and environmental factors. The sample was deemed too corrupted to yield meaningful results. But Dr. Lionel Greer, a geneticist consulted on the case, wasn't convinced. In a private email to the lead investigator, later leaked to a true crime podcast, Greer wrote, "The sequences don't align with common scavengers, opossum, raccoon, coyote, wild boar. They don't align with bears. There are markers here I can't place. If I had to guess, I'd say severe contamination. But I've been doing this for 23 years, and I've never seen contamination produce this kind of pattern." The email ended with a sentence that sent chills through the online true crime community when it surfaced. It's almost like something we haven't catalogued yet. By summer 2024, Clara Whitmore's case was closed on paper. Cause of death, undetermined. Manner of death suspicious, no arrests, no suspects. Oh, the remains were released to the family, and in June Clara was finally laid to rest in Cullman City Cemetery, her grave marked by a simple granite headstone that read, Clara Jean Whitmore, 1956-1984, forever loved, never forgotten. But for those who dug deeper, who read between the lines of the official reports, who listened to the whispers from investigators and forensic techs who'd seen things they couldn't explain, the case wasn't closed at all. It was just beginning to reveal its true shape, because the question wasn't just who killed Clara Whitmore. It was what happened in those woods on a warm October night in 1984. And why, after 40 years, did the answer still feel just out of reach, lurking somewhere in the shadows between the pines, waiting? The summer after Clara's burial brought an unexpected wave of attention to Cullman County. True crime podcasts picked up the story. YouTubers made deep-dive videos analyzing the forensic reports. Reddit threads exploded, with theories ranging from the plausible to the paranoid. But beneath the internet noise, something quieter was happening. People who'd lived in the area for decades were finally talking about things they'd kept to themselves for years. Detective Sarah Vance, who'd taken over Clara's cold case in 2019, started receiving calls. Not tips, exactly, but stories. Fragments of experiences that people had dismissed or rationalized away, now suddenly relevant in light of Clara's discovery. Sarah was 43, a transplant from Birmingham who'd earned her detective's badge through relentless competence and a reputation for taking witnesses seriously, even when their accounts sounded strange. She set up interviews, driving her unmarked Tahoe down back roads to farms and mobile homes, sitting at kitchen tables with people who'd been waiting decades to be believed. One of the first calls came from a woman named Judith Crenshaw, 71, who lived in a weathered farmhouse off Highway 157, less than 2 miles from where Clara's car had been found. Judith had been 41 in 1984, raising 3 kids, while her husband worked the second shift at the poultry plant. She remembered the night Clara disappeared, not because she knew about it then, but because of what she'd heard. Sarah sat across from Judith in a living room filled with porcelain figurines and faded family photos, her recorder running on the coffee table between them. Judith's hands shook slightly as she poured sweet tea into mason jars. "I never told anyone but my husband," Judith began, her voice thin but steady. "Because who would believe it? And what good would it do? But that night, October 16th, I was up late with my youngest. He had an ear infection, crying something awful. It must have been close to 10 o'clock when I heard it." Sarah leaned forward. "Heard what, Mrs. Crenshaw?" Judith's eyes went distant. "A sound. Out in the woods behind our property. Like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite a scream, not quite a growl. Somewhere in between. It made the hair on my arms stand up. And then I heard something else, crashing through the brush, heavy, moving fast. The tree branches snapping like gunshots." "Could it have been a deer?" Sarah asked gently. "That's what I told myself," Judith said. "That's what I've told myself for 40 years. But deer don't make that sound, and they don't move that heavy. This was something big, something that didn't care what it broke on its way through." Sarah made notes. "Did you see anything?" Judith shook her head. "I was too scared to look out the window. I just held my baby and prayed whatever it was would pass by. The sound moved south, toward the creek, and then silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, you know? Like even the crickets were holding their breath." She paused, sipping her tea. "The next morning, when I heard about that woman's car being found, I got a feeling in my gut, but I didn't call the police." What was I going to say? That I heard something scary in the woods. They'd think I was crazy, so I kept quiet. We all kept quiet. Sarah would hear variations of that same story over the next 3 months. A pattern emerged. Accounts of strange sounds, unexplained disturbances, and a pervasive sense of wrongness concentrated in a roughly 20-square-mile area between Highway 157 and County Road 1181. The same area where Clara had vanished and 16 miles through impossible terrain where her body had been found. Marcus Webb, a retired park ranger who'd worked the Bankhead National Forest District in the 80s and 90s, met Sarah at a Waffle House off Interstate 65. He was a big man, 70 now, with sun-damaged skin and hands that trembled from Parkinson's. But his memory was sharp. "We had protocols," Marcus said, dumping creamer into his coffee. "If someone reported seeing something strange, hearing something unusual, we'd investigate. File a report. Most of the time it was nothing. Kids drinking in the woods, illegal hunting, maybe a bear passing through. But there was this one area, off the service road near Crooked Creek, where we'd get calls maybe 3-4 times a year. Always the same thing. People saying they felt watched, saying they heard footsteps keeping pace with them through the trees, saying they found tracks that didn't make sense." "What kind of tracks?" Sarah asked. Marcus pulled out his phone, a surprising gesture from a man his age, and scrolled through photos. "I took pictures before I retired, kept them on a thumb drive just in case." He turned the screen towards Sarah. The image showed a dirt trail, probably a fire road, and in the center, pressed into dried mud, was a print. It was roughly foot-shaped, maybe 16 inches long, with what looked like 4 toe impressions at the front and a broad heel. But the proportions were off. Too narrow at the midfoot, too wide at the toes. "Bear?" Sarah suggested. "That's what I wrote in the report," Marcus said. "But look at the depth. Whatever made that print was carrying serious weight, and look at the stride." He swiped to another photo showing multiple prints in sequence. 6 feet between steps. That's not a bear. Bears don't walk like that, not consistently. Sarah studied the images. "Did you ever see what made them?" Marcus's expression darkened. "Once. Maybe. It was 1991, early spring. I was doing a perimeter check after a controlled burn. Sun was getting low, that golden hour before dusk. I was maybe a quarter mile off the main trail when I smelled it." "Smelled what?" "Sulfur. Rot. Like a dead animal mixed with, I don't know, hot metal. Hard to describe. Made my eyes water. And then I heard movement upslope from me through a stand of pine. I stopped, looked up, and I saw—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I saw a shape, tall, moving between the trees, upright. At first I thought it was a person, but the way it moved was wrong. Too smooth, too fast, and too big. Had to be 7 feet at least, maybe more. Could it have been a hiker?" Marcus gave her a look that said she was being generous. I called out, identified myself as a ranger. No response. The shape stopped, and I got the distinct feeling it was looking at me. Then it turned and moved off into the thicker brush, and I heard that same crashing sound people describe. Branches snapping, underbrush being plowed through. I followed for maybe 50 yards, but the light was failing and I lost the trail. He locked his phone and pocketed it. "I filed a report. Wildlife encounter. Species unknown. My supervisor told me to stop spooking myself. A month later, I was reassigned to a different section of the forest. Never worked that area again. These weren't isolated incidents. As Sarah compiled testimonies, she found that over 40 years, at least 30 people had reported unusual experiences in the Crooked Creek area. Hunters who'd abandoned tree stands because they felt something watching them from below. Fishermen who'd packed up mid-afternoon because the woods went silent in a way that felt predatory. A jogger in 2003 who'd sprinted back to her car after finding a deer carcass hanging 12 feet up in a tree. Its spine snapped. No rope or evidence of human involvement. The common thread. No one had connected these events to Clara Whitmore. They were just local strangeness, the kind of stories people told around campfires but didn't take to the authorities. Until now. Sarah requested access to Clara's original case file and spent 2 weeks in the basement archives of the sheriff's office, surrounded by boxes of moldering paperwork and photographs. What she found troubled her. The scene photos of Clara's Datsun showed more than just the scratches on the door. In one image, taken from the rear of the vehicle, the trunk was slightly ajar, something not mentioned in the initial reports. Sarah scanned through the evidence log. The trunk had been searched, yielded nothing of interest, but in one of Deputy Riggins's Polaroids taken before the car was processed, she could see into the gap. There was a dent in the trunk lid from the inside, as if something had struck it with force. A bulge in the metal pressed outward. Sarah compared it with the exterior photos. No corresponding impact from outside, which meant whatever caused the dent had originated inside the trunk. Had Clara been trying to escape from her own trunk? Or had something else been in there with her? The evidence bags from 1984 were still in storage, labeled and sealed. Sarah requisitioned them, hoping modern forensics might reveal something the 80s-era techs had missed. Most of it was unremarkable: Clara's purse, her keys, the Flannery O'Connor book. But one item caught her attention: a small plastic bag containing soil samples taken from around the car's tires and from the location where the shoe was found. Sarah sent the samples to the state lab with a specific request: test for biological material, any trace compounds, anything unusual. The results came back 3 weeks later, and they matched the findings from Clara's burial site. High sulfur content. Traces of an organic compound the lab couldn't identify. And something else: microscopic fibers, translucent and brittle, that didn't match any known plant or synthetic material. Dr. Vera Bozeman, the lab director, called Sarah personally. "Detective, I don't know what to tell you. These fibers, they're keratin-based, like hair or fur, but the structure is anomalous. They're thicker than human hair, hollow in the center like polar bear fur, but the protein sequence doesn't match any mammal in our reference database. And they're old. They've been degraded significantly, which is consistent with being buried for 40 years. So what are they?" Sarah asked. "I honestly don't know," Dr. Bozeman admitted. "If I had to speculate, and this is purely speculative, I'd say they came from a large mammal, something with a coat adapted for insulation or possibly aquatic environments. But we don't have anything like that in Alabama. We never have." Sarah thanked her and hung up, staring at the evidence bags spread across her desk. The pieces weren't fitting together, or rather, they were fitting together in a way that didn't make sense. She decided to walk the scene herself. On a humid morning in August 2024, Sarah drove out to Highway 157 with a topographical map, a GPS unit, and a Glock 19 on her hip she told herself was just protocol. She parked where Clara's car had been found, still identifiable by a faded spray paint mark on the asphalt from the 1984 investigation, and stood in the sultry silence. The forest pressed close on both sides. Loblolly pines rose tall and straight, their canopy filtering the sunlight into shifting green shadows. Underbrush choked the spaces between trunks: blackberry brambles, kudzu, wild azaleas. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. Sarah walked the 20 feet to where the shoe had been found. The creek was nearly dry now, just a trickle threading through red clay. She knelt, studying the ground. 40 years of erosion had long since erased any tracks, but the terrain itself told a story. The slope was gentle here, the vegetation not particularly dense. If Clara had run this way, voluntarily or pursued, she would have had a relatively clear path for maybe 100 yards before hitting thicker forest. Sarah activated her GPS and marked the location, then pulled up the coordinates of the burial site 16 miles away. She traced the route on her map. Between here and there, no roads, no trails, just wilderness. Steep ravines, creek crossings, sections of forest so dense you'd need a machete to make progress. To move a body that distance would require either a vehicle with off-road capability, unlikely given the terrain, or something else. She started walking. For the first quarter mile, the forest was almost pleasant. Birds called from the canopy, sunlight dappled the ground. But gradually, as Sarah moved deeper, the quality of the woods changed. The bird calls diminished. The underbrush grew thicker, more tangled. And the smell changed, subtle at first, then more noticeable. A faint, sulphurous note, like well water with too much mineral content. And underneath it, something organic and sour. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her sidearm. She came to a ravine maybe 15 feet deep, its sides slick with clay and exposed roots. At the bottom, a stagnant pool reflected the sky in fractured pieces. On the opposite bank, something caught her eye. Scratches on a pine tree, about 7 feet up the trunk. 3 parallel gouges, deep and deliberate, the wood beneath darkened with age and sap. Sarah took photos, then carefully descended into the ravine and climbed the other side, her boots slipping on wet clay. She approached the tree and ran her fingers over the marks. They were old, years old at least, but similar to the scratches on Clara's car door. Too high for most animals, too uniform to be accidental. And there were more. As Sarah continued through the forest, she found them. Trees marked with similar scratches, always on the south-facing side, always at a height of 6 to 8 feet. A trail of territorial markers, perhaps, or something else. A path. She followed them for 3 miles, checking her GPS periodically. The route curved and wandered, but the general direction was consistent, northwest, toward the area where Clara's body had been found. The sun was starting its descent when Sarah reached a clearing she hadn't expected. A natural depression in the forest floor, maybe 30 feet across, ringed by ancient oaks whose roots twisted above ground like arthritic fingers. The ground here was mostly bare dirt, compacted and hard. And in the center of the clearing, a smell so strong it made Sarah gag. Sulfur and decay. Overwhelming. She covered her nose with her sleeve and approached cautiously. The dirt showed disturbances, areas where something large had lain or moved repeatedly. Broken branches scattered around the perimeter, and at the base of one of the oaks, a collection of bones. Sarah's heart hammered as she knelt to examine them. Not human. She could tell that immediately. Deer, mostly. Rib cages picked clean, femurs snapped open for marrow, skulls scattered like dice. But also smaller animals, possums, raccoons, what might have been a coyote. And the way they were arranged wasn't random. They formed a rough circle, a boundary. This was a feeding site. Sarah took extensive photos, marked the GPS coordinates, and backed away slowly. The sun was lower now, shadows lengthening. She needed to get back to her vehicle before dark. The rational part of her brain said she'd found evidence of a large predator. A bear, maybe, though the behavior was atypical. The less rational part, the part that had listened to Judith Crenshaw and Marcus Webb, said she'd found something else entirely. She made it back to Highway 157 just as twilight settled in, her shirt soaked with sweat, her mind racing. That night, in her apartment in Cullman, Sarah compiled everything she'd found into a supplemental report. She included the photographs, the GPS data, the lab results on the unidentified fibers. She wrote carefully, clinically, avoiding speculation. But in her personal notes, in a journal she kept separate from official records, Sarah wrote something else. If Clara Whitmore ran into those woods to escape someone, she ran the wrong way. She ran deeper, not toward help. Why? Was she disoriented, injured? Or was she fleeing something that cut off her route to the road? The scatter pattern of her remains suggests movement. She wasn't killed and dumped. She was somewhere in those woods, alive, for at least some period of time. The question isn't just who killed her, it's what was out there with her in the dark. The next day, Sarah received an email from Dr. Lionel Greer, the geneticist who'd analyzed the contaminated DNA from Clara's cardigan. The subject line read, "You should see this." The email contained an attachment, a research paper from 2019 published in the Journal of Cryptozoological Studies, a fringe publication not widely accepted in mainstream science. The paper's title, Unidentified Primate DNA in North American Wilderness, Analysis of Hair and Tissue Samples from Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia, 2015 to 2018. Sarah opened the PDF with skepticism, but read it through. The authors, a team of independent researchers and one university biologist, who'd since distanced himself from the work, claimed to have collected biological samples from remote forest locations across the South. DNA analysis, they argued, revealed sequences that didn't match known species, not quite human, not quite ape, but something in between. The paper had been widely criticized for poor methodology and was never replicated by mainstream labs. But one of the sample locations listed in the paper was Bankhead National Forest, Cullman County, Alabama, less than 5 miles from where Clara's body had been found. Dr. Greer's email continued, "I know how this looks. I'm not saying I believe it. But the sequences we pulled from Clara's remains have markers similar to what this paper describes. I can't explain it. Maybe it's all contamination, degradation, and confirmation bias. Or maybe there's something in those woods we haven't documented yet. Either way, I thought you should know." Sarah sat back in her chair, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her face in the darkening office. Was this science or fiction? Evidence or fantasy? Or was it possible? Just barely possible? that the answer to Clara Whitmore's 40-year mystery wasn't found in police databases or criminal profiles, but out there in the forest, in the shadows between the pines, where something still moved and marked its territory, and perhaps on a warm October night in 1984, crossed paths with a quiet librarian who'd simply taken the wrong road home. Sarah Vance didn't share Dr. Greer's email with her captain. She knew how it would sound, a decorated detective chasing shadows based on a fringe science paper and unidentified hair samples. Instead, she did what good investigators do. She followed the evidence, even when it led somewhere uncomfortable. She started with the Bankhead National Forest sample site mentioned in the cryptozoology paper. The coordinates placed it near a section of forest called Devil's Backbone, a rocky ridgeline that ran parallel to County Road 1181. The area was remote even by Bankhead standards, no marked trails, no campsites, accessible only by bushwhacking through dense undergrowth or following dry creek beds that turned treacherous after rain. Sarah didn't go alone this time. She brought Tyler Merchant, a younger detective she trusted, and 2 volunteers from the county search and rescue team who knew the terrain. They set out on a Saturday morning in early September, when the Alabama heat had finally broken, and the forest had that crisp, anticipatory feel of approaching autumn. The hike took 3 hours. They followed GPS coordinates through terrain that fought them every step, blackberry thorns that tore at their clothes, creek crossings where the rocks were slick with algae, slopes so steep they had to pull themselves up by tree roots. Tyler, 32 and fit, was breathing hard by the time they reached the ridgeline. "Christ, Sarah," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Who the hell comes out here? People looking for something they don't want found," one of the search and rescue volunteers, a woman named Carmen Rodriguez, said. She was 50, lean and weathered from years of outdoor work, and she moved through the forest with the ease of someone who belonged there, or people running from something. They found the sample site marked on Sarah's GPS, a small clearing on the south side of the ridge, sheltered by a rock overhang that formed a shallow cave. The ground was littered with leaves and pine needles, undisturbed for years. But as they searched the area, Carmen called out, "Over here." She was standing near the cave entrance, pointing at the rock face. Scratches. The same parallel gouges Sarah had seen on the trees, but these were scored into stone, deep enough that lichen had grown in the grooves. They formed a pattern running vertically down the rock face in sets of 3 and 4, some as high as 9 feet off the ground. Tyler approached cautiously. "What could do that to solid rock?" "Nothing I want to meet," Carmen said quietly. Sarah photographed the marks from multiple angles, then examined the cave entrance. It was shallow, maybe 15 feet deep, the floor covered in dried leaves and animal droppings. But at the back, partially hidden under debris, she found something that made her pulse quicken. Bones. Human bones. Not a full skeleton, just a few fragments. A section of jawbone with 3 teeth still attached, part of a femur. Several small bones that might have been fingers. They were old, stained dark by soil and time, scattered as if disturbed by scavengers. Sarah's mind raced. She pulled out her phone, but there was no signal this deep in the forest. "Tyler, mark this location. We need to call this in." "You think it's another victim?" Tyler asked. "I don't know, but we need forensics out here immediately." They took photographs, documented the scene without disturbing it further, and began the long hike back to where they'd parked. By the time they reached the vehicles, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for what they'd found. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation responded within days. A forensic team excavated the cave site, recovering enough skeletal material for analysis. Dental records and DNA would take weeks, but the initial assessment suggested the remains had been there for decades, possibly as long as Clara's, and they weren't the only ones. Over the next month, as the ABI expanded their search grid around Devil's Backbone, they found 3 more sites with human remains. All skeletal, all decades old. All in remote, difficult-to-access locations that suggested the bodies had either been moved there deliberately or the victims had fled deep into the forest before dying. The media picked up the story immediately. "Alabama Forest Yields Multiple Victims in Decades-Old Mystery," ran the headline in the Birmingham News. Cable news networks sent crews. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit returned, this time treating the case not as a single missing person, but as a potential serial killer investigation spanning 40 years. But as authorities interviewed families of missing persons from across the region, comparing DNA from the remains to databases of the disappeared, a troubling pattern emerged. The victims, 4 including Clara, had vanished from different counties, different years, with no obvious connection. Different ages, different backgrounds. No common thread except one. They'd all disappeared near forested areas, and their remains had all been found miles from any road, deep in wilderness that most people never saw. Serial killers had patterns, geographic clusters, victim types, methods. This case had none of that. It was random, scattered across decades, without the signature behaviors that criminal profilers relied on. "It's like they were taken by the forest itself," Tyler said one evening in Sarah's office, surrounded by case files and topographical maps pinned to the walls. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was studying the map, red pins marking each location where remains had been found, black pins showing where victims were last seen. The distances bothered her. 3 to 16 miles of brutal terrain between abduction and deposition. No vehicles could make those trips. No human could carry a body that far through that landscape, not without leaving evidence, unless the bodies had been alive when they entered the forest, unless they'd walked, or run, or been chased. "What if it's not a serial killer?" Sarah said quietly. Tyler looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we're looking at this wrong? What if these people weren't abducted in the traditional sense? What if something chased them into the woods? Something they were trying to escape?" Tyler's expression was carefully neutral. "Like what?" Sarah shook her head. She couldn't say it out loud, not here, not in an official capacity. "I don't know, but I think we need to look at historical records, animal attacks, unexplained deaths, anything in this area going back as far as we can find." What they found was a pattern that went back further than anyone expected. The Cullman County Library, the same building where Clara had worked 40 years earlier, held newspaper archives dating back to 1903. Sarah and Tyler spent days scrolling through microfilm, searching for keywords: missing, woods, attack, unexplained. What emerged was a timeline of incidents stretching back over a century. 1911, a family of 4 disappeared while traveling by wagon between Cullman and Jasper. Their wagon was found overturned near Crooked Creek, the horses dead in their traces, with what the newspaper described as wounds of unknown origin. The family was never found. 1923. A moonshiner named Caleb Harding was found dead in the Bankhead Forest, his body showing evidence of mauling by a large animal, though no bears have been seen in the county for decades. 1947. 2 hunters reported being stalked by something that walked like a man, but moved through the trees like a creature. They fired shots and fled. Neither returned to the woods. 1959. A teenager named Michael Pressman vanished during a camping trip with friends. His companions claimed they heard him scream in the night, ran toward the sound, and found his sleeping bag torn to pieces and drag marks leading into the forest. Michael's body was never recovered. 1967. A Forest Service employee reported finding tracks of enormous size, neither human nor bear, near what would later become the area where Clara's car was found. And on and on. Not every year, not even every decade, but regular enough to form a pattern. People disappearing in the forest. Strange tracks, unusual animal attacks. Reports of something large and upright moving through the trees. Most of these incidents had been dismissed individually. Accidents, wild animals, hoaxes. But taken together, they suggested something persistent, something territorial, something that had been in these woods long before Cullman County was settled and remained there still. Sarah compiled the historical data into a report she titled Temporal Analysis of Unexplained Incidents, Cullman and Winston Counties, 1903-2024. She presented it to her captain, FBI liaisons, and the ABI team leader in a conference room at the sheriff's office. The response was mixed. The FBI agent, a woman named Carla Dennison, who specialized in cold cases, listened politely and then said, Detective Vance, you've done excellent work documenting these incidents. But correlation isn't causation. These are rural counties, with vast wilderness areas. People get lost, animals attack, accidents happen. What you're describing sounds like a century of normal statistical variation, not evidence of a single perpetrator or phenomenon. Then how do you explain the physical evidence? Sarah countered. The marks on Clara's car, the scratches on the trees and rocks, the unidentified DNA, the bone scatter patterns that don't match known scavengers. Agent Dennison folded her hands on the table. I can't explain all of it, but I also can't build a criminal case around the theory that some unknown creature has been hunting people in Alabama for 100 years. We need a suspect, a human suspect. Someone who lived in this area during the relevant time periods and had access to the locations where remains were found. There is no human suspect, Sarah said, frustration creeping into her voice. We've cross-referenced every known predator, every violent offender, every person of interest in the region for the past 50 years. Nothing connects. Then we keep looking, Dennison said firmly, because the alternative you're suggesting isn't something I can put in a federal report. The meeting ended without resolution. Sarah returned to her office feeling defeated, but also oddly validated. The fact that no conventional explanation fit meant she wasn't crazy for considering unconventional ones. That evening she received a visitor. Beth Whitmore, Clara's younger sister, appeared in the doorway of the detective bureau just before 6 o'clock. She was thin, dressed in a simple floral dress and cardigan despite the lingering heat, her silver hair pulled back in a bun. Her eyes, the same grey-green as Clara's had been in photographs, held a mixture of grief and determination. Detective Vance, I'm sorry to come without calling. Do you have a moment? Sarah waved her in and offered coffee, which Beth declined. They sat in Sarah's cramped office, surrounded by case files and photographs Beth couldn't see from her angle. I've been following the news, Beth said, about the other remains they found, about the investigation. I'm sorry it's bringing everything back, Sarah said gently. Beth shook her head. It never really went away, but that's not why I'm here. I came because I remembered something Clara told me about a week before she disappeared. Sarah leaned forward, pulling out her notebook. Clara and I were close, Beth continued. We talked on the phone 2-3 times a week. That October she seemed distracted, nervous. I asked her what was wrong, and she said something strange had been happening at her cottage. What kind of strange? Things moved. Objects she was certain she'd left in one place would turn up somewhere else. A book she'd left on the kitchen table would be on the porch, her garden tools rearranged. At first she thought she was being forgetful, but then she started noticing other things. Like what? Beth's hands twisted in her lap. Sounds at night. Scratching on the side of the house like something was testing the walls. She'd look out the window and see nothing, but she'd hear it moving around out there. And the smell. She said sometimes when she came home from work, there'd be this awful smell near her front door, like rot and sulfur. Sarah's blood went cold. Did she report it to the police? No. She was embarrassed, I think. Thought people would say she was hysterical. She lived alone out there, and you know how people talk about single women living by themselves. She didn't want to seem paranoid. Did she say anything else? Beth nodded slowly. The last time we talked, 2 days before she disappeared, Clara said she'd seen something. She was driving home from work just after dark and something crossed the road in front of her car. She said it was tall, walking on 2 legs, but not like a person. She slammed on the brakes and it turned and looked at her. She said she could see its eyes in her headlights, reflective like an animal's, and then it moved off into the trees, fast. Did she describe it further? She said it was covered in dark hair, matted and dirty, and that it moved wrong, like its joints bent in ways that weren't natural. She laughed when she told me, said she must have seen a bear standing up, that her imagination was running away with her. But I could hear the fear in her voice. She wasn't laughing because it was funny. She was laughing because she didn't want to believe what she'd seen. Beth's eyes filled with tears. I told her to come stay with me and our parents for a few days. She said she would that weekend, but she never made it to the weekend. Sarah reached across the desk and took Beth's hand. Thank you for telling me this. I know it's not easy. Do you think it means something? Beth asked. Or am I just an old woman trying to make sense of senseless tragedy? I think, Sarah said carefully, that your sister saw something real. And I think whatever she saw might be connected to what happened to her. Beth squeezed Sarah's hand and left, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Sarah sat in the silence, Beth's testimony playing in her mind. Clara had been stalked, watched. Her home had been targeted. And then, on a quiet October evening when she'd driven home alone, something had been waiting. Sarah pulled out the crime scene photos from 1984 and studied them with fresh eyes. Clara's car on the shoulder, door open, engine running, the scratches on the door, the dent in the trunk from the inside, the shoe 20 feet into the woods. A new scenario formed. Clara driving home, nervous, aware she was being followed or watched. She pulls over, maybe seeing something in the road ahead or hearing something that makes her stop. She gets out, voluntarily or forced. She runs into the woods, losing a shoe in the mud. She's pursued. The pursuit is fast, violent, relentless. She runs deeper, away from the road, disoriented in the dark. Miles and miles through terrain that tears at her clothes and skin. And eventually, somewhere in those woods, she can't run anymore. It wasn't a predator taking prey. It was a hunt. Sarah's phone rang, startling her. It was Dr. Hartwell, the forensic anthropologist who'd examined Clara's remains. Detective, I thought you should know. We've completed analysis of all 4 sets of remains from the Bankhead sites. The trauma patterns are consistent across all of them. Peri-mortem fractures suggesting falls or significant impact, and post-mortem scavenging with those unusual tooth or claw marks I mentioned in my initial report. Consistent with what? Sarah asked. Doctor, Hartwell paused. That's the problem. I've consulted with colleagues who specialize in wildlife predation. The marks don't match known predators in Alabama. They're too large for coyotes, wrong pattern for bears, too uniform for wild boars. One of my colleagues who's worked cases in Alaska and Montana said they remind her of marks left by large primates, but we don't have large primates in North America outside zoos. What are you saying? I'm saying I can't give you a definitive answer. The evidence suggests these victims were attacked by something, but I can't tell you what. It's outside my frame of reference. After the call ended, Sarah sat in the dark office, the only light coming from her computer screen. Outside, Cullman settled into night. Families eating dinner, kids doing homework, the ordinary rhythms of small-town life. But beyond the streetlights, beyond the subdivisions and strip malls, the forest waited in darkness, holding secrets it had kept for over a century. Sarah thought about Clara Whitmore, 28 years old, running through those woods in terror on a warm October night. Thought about the others who'd met similar fates, their bones scattered in caves and hollows where sunlight barely reached. Thought about the families who'd spent decades wondering, grieving, never getting answers that made sense. And she thought about the thing in the woods, whatever it was. Whatever had marked the trees and scored the stone and left DNA that didn't match any known creature. The thing people had reported seeing for 100 years, but never proven. The shadow that moved between the pines and hunted when the opportunity arose and survived, generation after generation, in wilderness that civilization had never quite conquered. Was it real? Or was it easier to believe in monsters than to accept that sometimes people just disappeared, and the forest kept its secrets and there were no answers at all? Sarah didn't know, but she knew she couldn't let it go. She printed out a map of the forest, marked every location where remains had been found, every historical incident she'd uncovered, every sighting report that had been dismissed or ignored. The pins formed a pattern, a territory roughly 30 square miles, centered around Devil's Backbone and the Crooked Creek watershed. And somewhere in that territory, Sarah believed, the answer waited. She would find it. For Clara. For the others. For everyone who'd disappeared into those woods and never come home. Even if the truth was something nobody wanted to believe, the decision to conduct a night observation came from Sarah herself. It wasn't approved by the department. It wasn't sanctioned by the FBI. It was the act of a detective who'd gone too far down a path to turn back, who needed to see with her own eyes what, if anything, haunted those woods. She told no one. On a Friday night in late October 2024, 40 years to the week after Clara Whitmore disappeared, Sarah drove out to Highway 157 alone. She parked at a different location this time, a Forest Service access road that led into the heart of the territory her map had outlined. She wore dark clothing, carried a high-powered flashlight, a backup battery pack, her service weapon, and a GoPro camera mounted to her chest. If something happened, there would be a record. The October air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and creek water. Sarah locked her vehicle and began walking, following a barely visible trail into the forest. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to navigate by once her eyes adjusted. She moved slowly, deliberately, stopping every few minutes to listen. For the first hour, she heard only normal forest sounds, the distant hoot of an owl, wind rustling through the pine canopy, the skitter of small animals in the underbrush. But as she moved deeper, approaching the area near the feeding site she'd discovered, the sounds changed. The forest grew quieter. The normal nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs diminished until she was walking in near silence. Sarah's heartbeat quickened. She checked her GoPro, making sure it was recording, and continued forward. That's when she smelled it. Faint at first, then stronger. Sulfur and decay. The same smell every witness had described, the same smell Raymond Tutwiler had warned about decades ago. It made her eyes water, made her stomach clench. She pulled her shirt up over her nose and moved toward the source. The feeding site clearing appeared before her, bathed in moonlight filtered through the oak canopy. And Sarah stopped dead. Something was there. At first, her brain struggled to process what she was seeing. A shape, massive and dark, hunched over something on the ground near the center of the clearing. It was facing away from her, and in the dim light, all she could make out was a silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, covered in what looked like matted hair or fur. It moved with deliberate purpose, and she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the crack of bone breaking. Sarah's hand moved to her weapon, but she didn't draw it. Some instinct told her that showing aggression would be catastrophic. Instead, she slowly, carefully raised her flashlight. Before she could decide whether to turn it on, the creature stopped moving. Its head turned, not all the way around, but enough that Sarah knew it had detected her presence. For 3 heartbeats that felt like hours, neither of them moved. Then it stood. The motion was fluid, unnaturally smooth, rising to its full height in one continuous movement. Sarah's mind screamed the word, tall. 7 feet, maybe more. The moonlight caught its form in profile, humanoid but wrong, the proportions off, the shoulders too wide, the arms too long. And then it turned its head fully toward her. Sarah saw eyes. Not reflected in her flashlight, she hadn't turned it on yet, but visible anyway, catching ambient moonlight with a luminous quality that shouldn't have been possible. They were large, set deep in what she could now see was a face, though the features were obscured by shadow and hair. Every rational thought in Sarah's mind told her to run, but she couldn't move. She was frozen, locked in place by something primal that overrode conscious thought. The creature regarded her for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. And then it made a sound, not a growl, not a scream. Something between the two, a low rumbling vocalization that Sarah felt in her chest as much as heard with her ears. It wasn't threatening exactly. It was more like a warning or a question. What are you doing in my territory? And then the creature turned away from her, dropped to all fours with a grace that defied its size and moved. It didn't run exactly. It flowed through the forest, weaving between trees, pushing through underbrush that should have slowed it down but didn't. Within seconds it had disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the sound of snapping branches that faded quickly into silence. Sarah's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the forest floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The GoPro was still recording. She'd captured it. Whatever it was, she'd captured it on video. She sat there for 20 minutes, waiting for her heart rate to slow, waiting to be sure the creature was truly gone. Then she stood on unsteady legs and walked carefully into the clearing. Her flashlight, now switched on, illuminated what the creature had been working on. A deer carcass, fresh, still warm. The ribs had been cracked open, the organs removed with surgical precision. This was active predation, feeding behavior. Sarah documented the sight with her camera, then retreated. She didn't run, but she walked fast, keeping her flashlight on, checking over her shoulder every few steps. She made it back to her vehicle without incident, and sat inside with the doors locked, trembling for 15 minutes, before she felt steady enough to drive. Back in her apartment, Sarah downloaded the GoPro footage to her laptop and watched it with the lights on, and her service weapon on the desk beside her. The video quality wasn't great. The moonlight was dim, the GoPro's low light capability limited, but it was there. A dark mass, clearly visible, standing upright. The eyes reflecting light. The smooth, impossible movement as it departed. It wasn't proof, not the kind that would hold up in court or convince skeptics. The footage was ambiguous enough that someone could argue it was a bear or a person in costume, or even a hoax. But Sarah knew what she'd seen. More importantly, she knew what Clara Whitmore had seen 40 years earlier on that October night. Clara had encountered the same thing, and unlike Sarah, who'd been left alone, Clara had run, or been chased. And that chase had ended 16 miles into the forest, where Clara's strength had finally given out and the hunt had concluded. The question was, what to do with this knowledge? Sarah wrestled with it for 3 days. She watched the footage dozens of times. She read everything she could find about similar sightings across North America, and there were many, stretching back centuries, concentrated in forested regions from the Pacific Northwest to the Appalachian Mountains. Indigenous peoples had stories about them. Settlers had reported encounters. Every generation had its witnesses, most of whom were dismissed or ridiculed. And maybe that was the right response. Maybe some things were better left in the realm of folklore and campfire stories. Maybe the world wasn't ready for proof that something unknown, something that defied classification, lived in the forests we thought we'd mapped and understood. But Clara's family deserved the truth. All the families did. Sarah made her decision. She requested a meeting with Beth Whitmore, just the two of them, at Beth's home. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, Sarah sat in the same living room where she'd interviewed Beth months earlier and told her everything. The historical pattern, the physical evidence, the DNA that didn't match, the feeding sites, and finally, what Sarah had seen in the woods. Beth listened in silence, her face unreadable. When Sarah finished showing her the GoPro footage on her laptop, Beth was quiet for a long time. "Do you think that's what killed Clara?" she finally asked. "I think Clara encountered something she didn't understand," Sarah said carefully. "Something territorial and powerful. I think she ran, and in running she triggered a predatory response. I don't think it was malicious. I think it was instinct. So my sister was killed by an animal no one will admit exists," Beth said, her voice hollow. "Or," Sarah said gently, "Clara got lost in the woods after a traumatic encounter, succumbed to exposure and injury, and was scavenged by wildlife after death. The evidence supports both interpretations. I can't tell you which one is true." Beth looked at the frozen image on the laptop screen, the dark shape, the reflecting eyes. "If you tell people about this, they'll think you're crazy. They'll ruin your career." "I know. So why tell me?" "Because you deserve to know what I found. What you do with that information is up to you." Beth closed the laptop and handed it back. She walked to the window and looked out at her quiet suburban street, where nothing mysterious ever happened, where the world made sense. When she turned back, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "I think," she said slowly, "that Clara died in the woods. I think something chased her, or she was running from something, and she got lost and injured and scared. And I think in the end, the forest took her. Whether that forest contained a creature science doesn't recognize, or whether Clara died of exposure and fear, and her remains were scattered by normal animals, I'll never know for certain. But I know my sister is finally home. She's been laid to rest, and maybe that has to be enough." Sarah nodded. "I think Clara would appreciate that wisdom." "What will you put in your final report?" Beth asked. "The truth," Sarah said. "That Clara Whitmore and 3 other victims died in the Bankhead National Forest, under circumstances that remain partially unexplained. That physical evidence suggests the involvement of a large predator or predators, that no human suspect has been identified. The case will remain open but inactive. And the video? Sarah considered. I'll keep it. Maybe someday, when we have better technology or better understanding, it'll mean something. But for now, it's just one more piece of evidence that raises questions we can't answer. They sat together in silence for a few minutes, two women bound by a mystery that had consumed months of their lives and decades of the Whitmore family's grief. "Thank you, Detective," Beth finally said, "for caring enough to look for the truth even when it led somewhere impossible." Sarah left Beth's home feeling both relief and sadness. She'd done what she could. She'd followed the evidence as far as it would go. And if the answer wasn't the tidy resolution everyone wanted, at least it was honest. The official case closure came in November 2024. The press conference was brief. The Cullman County Sheriff announced that Clara Jean Whitmore and 3 other individuals had been positively identified from remains found in Bankhead National Forest. The deaths were ruled as suspicious, cause undetermined, with no suspects identified. The FBI would maintain the case in their unsolved files. Families could finally have closure, even if justice remained elusive. The media coverage was extensive but short-lived. Within weeks, the story faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher mysteries. Clara Whitmore became a footnote in Alabama history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolated roads and dark forests. But in Cullman County, among those who lived near the woods, the story took on a different life. Hunters started avoiding certain areas. Hikers shared warnings about the territory around Devil's Backbone. Parents told their teenagers to be home before dark, especially when driving roads that bordered the forest. The stories that had been whispered for generations found new voice, tales of something in the trees, something that watched and waited and occasionally hunted. Sarah Vance returned to regular detective work, handling domestic disputes and theft cases, and the ordinary crimes that filled small-town police departments. But she kept the GoPro footage on an encrypted drive in her home safe. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, she'd open the file and watch those few seconds of video, studying the shape in the darkness, wondering what she'd really seen. She thought about Marcus Webb, the retired ranger who'd glimpsed something decades ago and been reassigned. She thought about Raymond Tutwiler, who'd smelled rot and metal and never returned to those woods. She thought about Deputy Riggins, who'd felt watched from the trees and requested a transfer. She thought about Judith Crenshaw, who'd heard something that made her hold her baby tight and pray for it to pass. They'd all known in their own way. They'd all touched the edge of something they couldn't explain and had the wisdom to step back. Sarah had gone further. She'd looked into the darkness and seen it look back, and she'd lived to tell the tale, even if no one would believe it. In December, Sarah returned to the feeding site one more time, in daylight, with Tyler Merchant accompanying her for safety. The clearing was empty, the bones scattered by scavengers. But on one of the oak trees marking the perimeter, there was a new set of marks, fresh scratches, scored deep into the bark at a height of 8 feet. They were still weeping sap. Tyler photographed them and asked, "What do you think it means?" "I think it means this is still its territory," Sarah said, "and we're just visitors." They left the woods and didn't return. Years from now, someone else will find those marks. Someone else will hear the stories and follow the evidence into the forest. Someone else will smell sulfur and decay and see eyes reflecting in the darkness. And they'll have to decide, as Sarah did, whether to believe what their senses tell them or trust what civilization insists is real. The truth, Sarah had learned, isn't always singular. Sometimes 2 contradictory things can both be true. Clara Whitmore died in the Alabama woods in October 1984. She was killed by exposure and injury and fear. She was also killed by something that hunted her through the darkness. Both statements are accurate, both are incomplete. And that's the nature of mysteries that touch the edge of the unknown. We can document them, investigate them, gather evidence and testimony, and DNA samples. But we can't always explain them, not in ways that fit neatly into reports and database entries. Some questions don't have answers. Some cases don't close, not really. They just transform into stories we tell ourselves, trying to make sense of a world that's wilder and stranger than we want to admit. Clara Jean Whitmore rests now in Culman City Cemetery, her headstone marking a life cut short, and a mystery that outlived her by 40 years. People visit sometimes, leaving flowers, paying respects to a woman most of them never knew, but whose story touched something deep in the collective consciousness. And in the forest, in the territory around Crooked Creek and Devil's Backbone, something still moves through the shadows. Something that's been there longer than the towns and longer than the roads. Something that occasionally crosses paths with humans, usually without incident, but sometimes with tragedy. Is it a creature science hasn't classified? A relic population of some unknown primate? Or is it simply the forest itself, vast and indifferent, reminding us that we're not the apex predators we think we are? The answer depends on who you ask. And maybe, in the end, that's the way it should be. Because there are places in this world where civilization's light doesn't quite reach, where the old rules still apply, where mystery persists not because we lack the tools to solve it, but because some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Clara Whitmore found one of those places on a warm October night in 1984. She stepped out of her car, into the darkness, and became part of a story that's been unfolding in those woods for centuries. And the story isn't over. It's just waiting for the next chapter. The next person who wanders too far from the road, the next encounter that blurs the line between the known and the impossible. The forest remembers. The forest waits. And somewhere in the shadows between the pines, something watches still. Could there be things in our forests that science hasn't yet explained? Or are we just afraid to accept that sometimes people are lost to nothing more than wilderness and chance?